Dr. Nikki Usher is with us. She is an associate professor at the University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign in the College of Media with affiliate appointments in communication and political science. Her newest book, News for the Rich, White, and Blue, How Place and Power Distort American Journalism, argues that the market failure facing newspapers is deeply problematic for the future of inclusive democratic life. The book considers how larger structural inequalities and political tensions in American life are satiated through and by the news media. Dr. Usher is also a senior fellow of the Open Markets Institute for Journalism and Liberty, where she focuses on media independence, platforms, and antitrust, and a CITAP faculty associate at University of North Carolina. There's many other things she's done, but I am going to go ahead and she's going to give you just an overview for about 5 minutes and then take questions and welcome discussions. So thank you, Dr. Usher, so much for waiting through till about 11:15, and we really appreciate you being here today.
Yeah, for sure. So what I thought I would do is actually give maybe like 10, 15 minutes, because I think that people are, at least this audience is really curious about like how we got to this point and, how to understand at least, if not what to do. So I'm actually going to share with you a presentation I shared actually with students in the Honors College at the University of Illinois who had sort of like very similar questions. So I hope you don't mind me doing a repeat performance, but I think that it'll be helpful just for people who need a general kind of backgrounder. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen and talk for a little bit, and we can, have questions after that. Okay. There we go. All right. So I'm going to start at the beginning. How did we get to this? It is a sort of how did we get to this point where there was what we call an attempted coup? The Klein Center here at the University of Illinois defined the insurrection as an attempted coup. How did we get here? How did we get to this point where people are actually charging the Capitol in violent, sort of an effort at violent rebellion? And to what extent can we actually implicate the media and our current sort of social media environment in all of this? And I think the answer is really kind of complicated because the best and worst of ourselves are reflected in social media, but social media's profit model is focused on making sure we're engaged, doesn't care what the content is. And so that best and worst of us ends up being amplified according to very sort of sophisticated behavioral economics and behavioral nudges that we may not even be aware of. I think we kind of have to maybe go back to 2016 and think about how it was that, most people who were following the news, this is 5:38, really thought that Hillary Clinton was going to win. The New York Times was so sure about the Hillary Clinton win that they didn't even have a mock-up for the Trump the Trump victory front page. And then subsequent to that, Dean Baquet, the editor of the New York Times, had the very next day sat down with his media reporter and said, we need to do a better job of getting out of New York City, getting out of these big cities, and actually understanding what's happening on the ground. And so this is also part of this mix, right? How the media, the most powerful, high quality news media is being concentrated around the coasts. And so I talk more about that in my book, but I think it's an important context. Hold on. Okay. See, it's like okay, so here was the slide that I should have said this morning, but I somehow skip ahead by one. So how do we get here? What can you do? What might we expect in the future? Okay. I think it's helpful to know that fake news has always been with us. You can think back to, there's a famous Mars, right? Orson Welles kind of telling people that Mars had attacked in New Jersey on Halloween in 1938, and that played out a lot of people's fears. It was wartime. It hadn't hit the US yet, right? And so it was like prime for people to freak out. And what has been up for debate is actually how many people freaked out, and maybe there was an exaggeration, but there's a long history of, fake news, hoaxes, bunk in American news, and in news generally, and with different levels and intentions in terms of trying to deceive people. I think what's maybe notable about the fake news that we've been encountering over the past two presidential elections is that it's very much political in nature, and it is designed with the intention not just of persuading, but of disinforming. And I think that, while there's this history of fake news, 2016 was really kind of when people encountered it for the first time. And so I think, and people really panicked, right? Because it seemed to be that somebody would, be so influenced by fake news that they might go and do something truly awful. So this is a still from the shooting at Comet Pizza by a crazy QAnon follower in DC, which you might remember. He was following Reddit and QAnon and believed that there were children being kept in a basement. Having been to Comet Pizza, I was in DC for 8 years. There is no basement there, right? So the real fear is that this exposure is going to lead to violent action like we saw in the insurrection. And so, I think all of these things that sort of were part of the fake news ecosystem were very deliberately designed with the intention of undermining democratic engagement and undermining democracy. And I think that's what's so scary. Everything from, the Cambridge Analytica scandal, the Russian Information Agency putting out fake news, deliberate hacks of the Democratic Party, and of course our own seeding of what was happening on Reddit. Okay. Right. And so, and I think one of the really difficult things was that the American news media didn't really understand, I think until late into 2019, 2020, how to deal with the fact that fake news was coming from and being endorsed by sort of the most powerful office in the country, right? The most powerful person in the world, arguably, is repeating all of this fake news, and not just repeating fake news, but calling the real news fake news. And one of the challenges that the American news media had was fitting Trump's discourse, which is anti-democratic, which is fake, right, into the traditional journalism norms of trying to remain unbiased, trying to present both sides of the story, trying to report accurately what was said and what happened for people who weren't there. But I think, and so trying to fit Trump into the norms of traditional American political discourse is still something I think the American news media is struggling with. Even the debate over whether to call the insurrection a coup or a riot, or, whether to call the former president directly racist, right? So these are some of the difficulties that kind of like the American news media, the mainstream American news media was not ready for somebody like Trump. And I don't know if they're ready for the next version of this. Sorry, I need to, okay. So, and I think that part of what's happening is first, and I should probably have a slide on this, like there's something called asymmetric polarization, which means that one party is significantly more polarized in its viewpoint and opinion than the other party. And we know that Republicans, for the most part, only 11% of Republicans trust what we would call the institutional news media, New York Times, CNN, Time Magazine, Newsweek, NPR, some of like some of these digital first outlets. And so that's really problematic when only 11% of Republicans say that they trust the news media compared to about 55% of Democrats. But worse than that is that Republicans and Democrats are living in sort of two different universes of where they're getting their news and information. And I think what's interesting is of this like sort of mainstream sources of news, I think the Wall Street Journal was maybe the one that was a crossover, but Republicans distrust more sources and Democrats trust more of these institutional news sources. But kind of living in these inverse information environments makes it really hard to, so one thing, you get the mainstream news media struggling to kind of keep after misinformation and disinformation. And then you've got the two parties with party adherents living in completely different information ecosystems. And that's how you get to this. I think this flag's taken by the AP, this photo. This is an arresting photo because for so many reasons, right? Like there couldn't be anything more antithetical to the way that, the US Congress understands itself than a man walking through it with a Confederate flag. So how did, and just trying to understand how we got here. Okay, so I'm going to actually skip this part, but just to really simplify it, there are kind of three eras of modern media. So what a lot of the audience here probably remembers is kind of the old broadcast era. I have a little bit of a memory of this, where it was pretty much like, news organizations were the gatekeepers between people and powerful. And there were a right-wing and left-wing media. There was, Fox, there was, talk radio, there were these, and that was really where like the most intense partisans lived. And on the left, there were sort of, smaller magazines, maybe Air America at the best, but like the most intense partisans were really invested in partisan media. And most Americans were getting their news from sort of like a set, there just wasn't as much media choice. And there wasn't there wasn't a way for the president to go directly to the public. And that's maybe the biggest change, is that the president had to go through the media to reach Americans, right? There was no direct channel. And that meant that news organizations were able to be gatekeepers between the people and the powerful. So that journalists were like the translators, right? And the biggest difference now is that politicians can go directly to the public on social media, and then journalists are playing catch up. So then we kind of entered in this sort of like meso area. And I think you probably all maybe remember some of this. And this is sort of like the birth of the blogosphere. And I think that this is like the pre-social media era, like kind of the more open web. And so some of you might remember like Wonkette or Talking Points memo, and the right had, this is where Drudge was born, and Andrew Sullivan. And so this blogosphere, is like, could they do journalism? And really what their role was, both on the right and the left, was to break some stories that the mainstream media was ignoring, from, racist things that Jesse Helms and Strom Thurmond, people of that era had said, and then elevating them. Issues with voting machine security. Ironic, that's come back. Like, so, they were more of like an alternative, almost like alt digital media. And still, like, most people were still getting this kind of like top down president through the media to most people. And so, sorry, I have trouble clicking through on Zoom for some weird reason. Is this how I do it? Sorry. Okay. And then we have now, and you can see that it gets messier and messier and messier. And I think that it's fair to say that Trump is very much operating in a sort of shadow president role as the leader of the Republican Party. He would anyway, I think, as leader of the opposition, but whether he's getting as much attention as other sort of opposition parties, out parties, is actually an interesting empirical question. But what's, I think, really important is looking at that link between the ability to go right to through in real time to Twitter, and kind of the growth of the fringe right. So you don't just have like the institutional right wing, Fox, right? The National Review, even traditional conservative talk radio, right? You actually have like a fringe right wing that has been enabled to get people, like the Alex Joneses of the world, Glenn Beck, Dan Boingo, like people who's Ben Shapiro, right? They have found an audience by engaging on platforms that like Facebook, that have given them tremendous reach, and those platforms, because of the data that they have about us and because of our interactions, have been able to target sort of like the most ideal audiences, right? So that Facebook is predicting based on your behavior, you might like to see this extreme stuff, and it will feed that stuff to you. I will say that this fringe right-wing media, if you've looked at any of it, like the Plandemic documentary that went around, it's pretty slick. Like when you see cutouts of Alex Jones or any of these kind of right-wing provocateurs, these, Tucker Carlson, if you take just a 30-second slice, they look like lunatics. But when you watch the whole show, right, there are especially these digital shows, which are then webcasts, they're really pretty well produced. And so I think people think that seem to forget that, like, the production value is good. Like you wouldn't necessarily look at that and think, oh yeah, that's clearly fake news, because it looks good, right? And it's easier to do that. And then the left really has a different kind of system. And it's a much weaker connection, I think, between Trump and people than it is Biden to left-wing partisans. Biden is still going very much, right, through the traditional mainstream media, reaching people through platforms like social media, through TV. But the people that he's reaching, right, have very fragmented attention. And what our research shows is that really the most politically engaged pay attention to politics more and more in this crowded ecosystem. But the people who were tuning out before and kind of maybe got some incidental news because maybe there'd be the local news on before the show they wanted to watch, right? They've tuned out even more so than ever before. And then you've got kind of like this left-wing digital media. And if you'll notice on the right, with Trump and the institutional right-wing media, there's like these very direct lines, right? Trump had people from Fox in his administration even, right? That link between Biden and kind of the left-wing digital media, which is, like it's there, it's Vox and Huffington Post and Pod Save America, but it is much weaker. And there's a real question, like, is it much weaker because the news media is actually liberal? Or is it that Democrats trust the news media to report reality? So the need for a full alternative media ecosystem isn't quite the same. And so, but I do think, right, this big difference that Biden and Trump can reach their partisans immediately through these social media platforms. And I think it's, I wish I had a better, more up-to-date thing where you could see like what this is an old Wall Street Journal page where you could see red feed, blue feed. And there are basically two entirely different universes of posts going to people based on their political identity. One of the most interesting things, though, is Facebook is wrong. People perceive Facebook to be wrong about and this is a Pew study, about their political identity about 20 to 30% of the time. So Facebook's actually guessing wrong, which I think is really interesting. So that Facebook's algorithm is actually miscategorizing some people. And so this feed might be targeted to people who don't want to see this stuff. So, that kind of gives you a sense of like, these different, it's alternative media ecosystems. And then when people go on social media, just entirely different universes of the news that they'll encounter there. Okay, hold on one second. All right, so I'm going to just stop there. But I could tell you, let me do one more slide about like the targeting and put it in the context of like a interpersonal relationship. So I'll kind of talk you through two different people who got increasingly radicalized based on the feeds that they're seeing in different ways. And it gives you a sense of like the ways in which our relationships are mediated through social media. Many of these are weak ties, like people would kind of know, right? Some of them are strong ties, people in our immediate family. But let's just kind of play out the scenario and then you can kind of see. So we've got two different people, right? Let's say they're U of I grads, right? One of them is out in California. They're part of the anti-vax movement, which has been traditionally quite strong in Southern California and California, right? They're sort of a little bit anti-institutional. They don't trust big pharma. They don't trust like, GMOs, left-wing homeschooling, really just sort of like, very anti-establishment, a little bit lefty, right? Digitally literate, and these, also went to this person's high school, person B. This person lives in Champaign-Urbana still. They're pro-vax. They shop at Harvest Market. They believe still in institutions, right? So maybe they deliberately send their kids to public schools and work hard to make them better. And really the orientation there is a belief that institutions can be fixed rather than having a violent overthrow, right? And so let's just say these are friends from high school. A makes a post that masks are bad because of the chemicals. B gets annoyed, comments. This fight gets elevated because, these are people who have these weak links and it's getting hot and Facebook wants to keep our attention. And so Facebook doesn't care whether this is a good conversation or a bad conversation. It's just getting a lot of engagement because people are fighting over this. So eventually B is like, I'm totally done with A. I'm just never like, I can't have this person in my social media feed. I don't want to see this person again. And so B unfriends A. And this is really increasingly happening. But because of this sort of anti-institutionalism that A has professed and sort of like, that A will get increasingly targeted for right-wing anti-institutional content. And you see these stories of sort of Manhattan women in their 60s who have become QAnon followers despite being like good liberal Manhattanites. And then, A starts doing her own research and goes down the pipe of kind of, problem. So what can we do? And I think that the first is really to be conscious that the news and the content that you're seeing is very much filtered through a for-profit model that is targeting based on information that these platforms think people want to see. I think it's really important to be careful about how we talk about fake news. Calling the mainstream media fake news is problematic, but fake news needs to be called out as fake and wrong, not false statement as the news media tends to do. And then I think if that lesson from that scenario is worth anything, it's that, it is important to keep people you disagree with in your lives. Not only are you enriching their social media feeds, giving them alternative debates, but people trust people they know. And one of the things we're learning is that if you meet people where they are, rather than by saying, I'm right, I've got all these facts, you're more likely, and you explain why it's important to you, you're more likely at least to have some sway in persuading folks. So, but I think the most important thing is just being conscious of what's going on. So I didn't really talk about my book because we did that a little bit in a previous conversation, but hopefully this explains to all of you a little bit better what's going on. So now I'm going to stop my share. And I would love to take some questions. And I lost my water, which is maddening.
Nikki, thank you so much for that overview. I found that very, very helpful.
Awesome. I'm like super thirsty. I need to figure out where I put my water.
I'll just jump in first as people are thinking. I think your caution about recognizing how algorithms work, that it's not information based, but it's geared towards attention, is really, really helpful. They're not trying to promote a conversation. They're just trying to keep us engaged. And to remember that when you're on different social media platforms.
Yeah.
I think that's excellent too, because I can see it. I've noticed it all along how different platforms are so divided up.
I have to say, and I was sort of watering plants and doing things while you were talking. So if I missed this, I apologize. But both sides are doing the disinformation thing. And I am a liberal, and but every now and then I catch my the people that I'm listening to, not necessarily deliberately misinforming, but leaving things out. And I'll just say, as an example, I listen to a Democracy Now! Headlines. I don't listen to the whole show, but get the headlines, usually in the morning or sometime. And recently, they were reporting on the shooting in Minneapolis where the no-knock warrant and a young man was killed. And she left out the part where, which was clear to everyone if you saw the video on any other news feed, was that the person that got shot had a gun. And it was clearly visible to everyone. And I don't know what that means for the whole investigation, or I'm not speaking up or against no-knock warrants, but why did Democracy Now! Leave that part out? I just found that very suspicious. And I see that, every now and then, maybe once every 3 months. And I'm not catching everything because I'm not that well informed. Anyway, that's all I would say.
No. That's a good question. I didn't show you this slide, but I think it might be helpful given your question. So I think it's helpful to have a wider vocabulary for what we call disinformation, because some of it is misinformation, right? Like just stuff that's like not quite right, or satire taken seriously. Like it's just kind of mistake information, right? Then there's disinformation, which is, something that's fabricated, it's intentionally created, conspiracy theories, right? The ivermectin, right, might be one, or that the 5G in your COVID shot. And then there's the malinformation, I think, which is, really targeted on individual or corporate level attacks to expose. Changing, if you've heard anything about deep fake videos, that will be an example of malinformation, for example. Kind of having a better vocabulary. But I think the thing is that all news is the process of, of decision makings that are very human, that are, the product, it's the idea that journalism can be a factual replication of reality falls apart once you realize all the choices that go into the construction of a story. And so while I can't speak to Democracy Now!'s choices, I think remembering that news is a process of selection is really important. But I also think that it's really important not to impute, even on the right and as well, like some sort of coherent agenda, because journalists don't have time for that. I've spent a lot of time in news organizations. There's no way that like NPR is getting on the phone. And I promise you that on the right, all of these folks are fighting for clicks. They're not really cooperating to have a coherent agenda. So I think, I don't know what Democracy Now! Is doing, but I do think we need to be careful in presuming that like there's some sort of media conspiracy among media outlets to prevent us from knowing X, right? If anything, it's that outlet making a decision, the product of decisions.
Right, the last minute, right. Well, thank you. That's very helpful.
Yeah.
And I would add to that just the whole challenge of this society where people want everything, they want to know everything in a tidbit. I mean, these little morsels of a story, and it never can tell the whole story. And so then people have a takeaway, and it's such a struggle, I think, because we're into this fast, get our news really fast and think we have it figured out, which I find it the whole thing I find so overwhelming. And it's super helpful, Nikki, to have you spelling it out because I see it all the time.
Yeah, I mean, I think that this critique of soundbite culture is one that there's actually a book called like Soundbite Culture that is from like the 90s, right? And part of that is attention, but also a reflection of the commercial news media system in which we operate, where it getting people's attention and making as much money as possible at any one point really drives the selection. And I think it used to be that journalists wouldn't ever talk about economics, and the economics were not front and center. But you've got two things that are really front and center in today's newsrooms. One, for any digital first or paper or magazine, it's digital subscriptions or audience size. And then for other news organizations, there's instant and immediate feedback from digital analytics about who's paying attention to what. And that can dictate what's going to get served up next because you're trying to capture people's attention. So maybe that's helpful.
Nikki, I have a question for you. In a historical context, is today's voter the voters collectively who are now subject to these incredibly powerful disinformation sources of information, are they really handicapped compared to voters historically in being able to make reasonable decisions at the ballot box? In effect, I guess I'm asking, has this change in information technology and the ability to target messages made it very difficult for voters to make good decisions?
I mean, I think that that there's been this presumption for a long time, and in my book, I really push back against this because I just don't think there's enough evidence for it. But political scientists will tell you, and maybe some of your future talks in the next couple of weeks, that voters need information to make good decisions, right? And there's this myth of sort of the rational, critical voter that goes in and weighs both sides and makes a good decision. When in reality, a lot of voters are low information voters that are making decisions based on whatever it is they're making decisions. I'm not sure that, it's a good question whether that proportion of people has grown, these low information voters. But what we're really seeing is the nationalization of news and information. And so the narratives that are playing out at the national scale end up getting trickled down locally. And as local sources of information become less robust, there's less information about what's happening locally. So people are making their decisions about what to think and how to feel based on national consideration. So if they're paying attention to the right national party, that's going to affect how they're voting locally and what they think of what's happening locally. And I think that the masking stuff is a really good example of that. So I think maybe that's really what maybe to look for, is to think about the ways in which the changing media system, but also people vote based on identity. And I think that people choose their media based on identity, and political scientists, like communication scholars, will shout this till they're blue in the face, that people make choices based on like who they are and where they are in the world, but political scientists tend to disagree with us. So it's a disciplinary argument. I hope nobody's a emeritus political scientist professor.
Well, I did have one comment, even though I'm not a political science professor. If you read the history of America and voting, and you look at like things in the late 1800s, early 20th century, and things like that, you see, voters aren't well informed. They're voting based on ethnicity. They're voting based on who is passing out the beer. They are getting their information from news media that are controlled by bigwigs somewhere else. So it's not necessarily that we have a big change from where we were before. It's just maybe a big change from where we thought we were in the 60s and 50s.
Well, and I'd also caution people to remember that a good half the country was really blocked from voting, and new efforts to restore people,
Yeah, that's true too.
Happening. And so I think that's, whenever there's this guy, Robert Putnam, who has this book, Bowling Alone. And it's the idea that people are increasingly detached from voluntary civic organizations. And he uses data from the 50s and 60s to make a lot of his arguments. But that data is extremely, it's extremely uninclusive, right? Fewer women were voting because they were vacuuming in their homes and their husbands went out to vote. And there was those one-car garages exist as a legacy to that, right? But also across the American South and even on the West Coast, in states like Oregon and Washington, Black Americans were really prohibited from voting with threats of violence, right? And so that data about political engagement and voluntary civic associations really misses the deep structural racism. And so that's kind of what I caution people when they look historically at this kind of stuff. Anything about voting is deeply it's problematic from the question of democracy, which is ironic, isn't it?
Yeah. I did run across an interesting book on the Cambridge Analytical thing, written from one of the guys that helped them write their programs. It's called Mind F***CK by Christopher Wiley.
Yeah.
And he's a young Canadian who's got sort of led down the primrose path to write the algorithms that made the Cambridge Analytical process possible. And it's really kind of interesting because it really didn't. The main thing, the Cambridge Analytical thing, that if I can summarize, which is a little simplified, is that it sent ads, figured out who was susceptible to the propaganda they were trying to promote, and sent ads out to reinforce it. And trouble is, we live in a society where everything's split about 50-50. So even if you can only persuade 1% of the population, you can definitely shift the outcome.
Yeah, so that's accurate. But I do think that that's at a national scale. When you look at the county level, and
yeah, this is definitely national, although the county level seems to wander in too, at least in Champaign County, where I think in 2018, as a reaction to the Trump, everything went totally Democrat, even though I thought there were some rather well-qualified Republicans.
Thanks.
So other questions? We're getting close to the noon hour, so I don't want to presume on anyone's time.
I just wanted to quickly ask, has the speaker looked at all at the impact of the disappearance of local newspapers, or is this out of your, what is the impact of that?
That is exactly what my book is about. So do you have a copy of that one, David? That would be fun.
I do, but it's at home.
Oh, no.
What is the book?
My book is called News for the Rich, White, and Blue: How Place and Power Distort American Journalism. And it's all about the decline of local news in the United States. I want to Google it because you would think I'd have this. It's here. I'm just sending you the Columbia University Press link. The Kindle version's, I think, like $9. But yeah, I mean, that's like, that has been my thing for 5 years. I just, we had a conversation about that this a couple weeks ago with the same group. So we're a similar group. So I didn't really want to do the exact same thing with y'all.
So I presume the impact is very derogatory.
It's interesting because I think that local news has definitely declined. Whether that local news, and it depends what we mean as local, but I think the News Gazette's a really good example of like, does the News Gazette provide us with a holistic picture of what's happening in our community? And I would argue that it has a lot of problems with covering anybody non-white and anybody not part of the business class in Champaign. And so there's a real question of like, well, has the News Gazette just simply reinforced the status quo, or has it played a really important role in creating a sense of identity, what it means to be from Champaign-Urbana and live in Champaign-Urbana? And I think it's a little of both, but I think it's really important not to idealize newspapers. They're good because they provide the most amount of information in any one place. And so losing that volume of information is perhaps problematic. But the idea that people were really even paying attention to sort of the bread and butter of like, what newspapers and consider their mission, right? Like education, politics, all that stuff. They weren't. People do still subscribe today. Even the New York Times bought Wordle, right? For crosswords and sports and commentary. And so I think we need to kind of have a clear-eyed view of what the role of news and newspapers have been. And I think for me, the big takeaway is in establishing a sense of place and a sense of community. And that I think is really important. And so, but of course, not everybody is included in that version of what a place is.
I have one question, if I have the time. And it's the issue of, we have so many choices of news these days. And we have such a heritage of freedom of speech, and let folks sort it out. Mm-hmm. But I'm wondering what your thoughts are, since you think about the media a lot. I'm increasingly concerned about its impact on democracy, our democracy. And I'm wondering what your thoughts are concerning regulation within the news media. I know it's delicate. Who's to make the decisions? How are they to be made? What are facts? I understand a lot of complex questions, but I welcome your thoughts on that.
So, I mean, I think that the free market of ideas has become the free market of private identity and private data. And that changes the nature of the marketplace of ideas, because it's no longer, it's always been problematic for all sorts of, structural reasons, that some ideas were always going to be counted more than others, right? But because there's so much personal data about us that is owned by these giant tech corporations, I mean, I tend to be just somebody who's really hesitant about media regulation generally. I tend to look at these things more from what's happening at the disruptor level, and are those disruptors playing fairly? And the answer is no. And so when Google, Facebook, and Amazon have tremendous data about every action that we take, and they own all of the inventory for digital advertising on the web, and you have to buy your ads through these Google and Facebook. They kind of own both sides of the exchange, right? They own the supply and the demand. I think it's that the co-option of our personal data That's the issue. This wouldn't be as much of a problem if there wasn't such an ability to target and nudge people in precisely the right ways. And what actually worries me more are the ways in which the susceptibility to behaviors for sort of personal self-destruction seem to be really cued. And I think a lot about gambling, actually. Somebody might see an ad for Las Vegas intentionally. And so it wouldn't necessarily be a gambling ad, and then it would be more because they might engage with that ad, right? And this person might be somebody who buys lottery tickets a lot. And so I worry a lot about those behavioral nudges that really are deliberately targeted at exactly the right people at exactly the right time. And that wouldn't happen if there wasn't this much private data about us owned by these huge corporations. So that's
And how about regulation then? And what are your thoughts? And because it's something you care so deeply about, what are your...
Well, I mean, I think the regulation comes for data privacy. I would rather keep the government's hands off of any kind of, regulatory, regulatory aspects on content. I am not in favor of. Of course, the thing to remember is that the government has tremendous power over media to begin with, right? And assigning station licenses, in assigning so every radio, like the FCC has to sign off on, every broadcaster in America, and decides whether, Sinclair can buy 3 stations in a single market. But also in terms of like postal subsidies, and who gets to have one. There are 2 bills under consideration in the Build Back Better. There was a provision that would allow for newspapers under a certain size to take payroll tax deductions and for people to receive a tax credit if they were doing a digital subscription. And then a second bill called the Save Journalism Act, I think, something just like that, that would give newspapers safe harbor to collectively sue Facebook, Google, because right now, according to American, that's collusion unless they are granted a safe harbor exemption to do so. So, I mean, I work for an antitrust policy group. I'm not a regulation person. I use the regulations that are there to create competition that's, actually competition. That's me. You're going to get really different. I'm not mainline answer on this. You should ask the other people that come through, because I tend to be a little bit idiosyncratic.
Yeah, I certainly agree with that and the privacy issue. If you've not seen it, Shoshana Zuboff came out with a book called Surveillance Capitalism a couple of years ago. It's a thick book, but she details the invasive ways Google, Facebook, Twitter collect our information and then own it, and then can profit from it. And we participate in that. No government regulation can stop us from signing on. And so when you load these apps onto your computer or onto your phone, their tentacles go through all the device. And so when you're doing transactions in another browser, the cookies send information to them, and you sign off on that every time you check your agreement to the terms. Whenever there's an update and you agree to the terms, you are giving them the approval to do that. So that's how they can target you with all of these ads. We are participating in that. We're enabling it. And until we become more informed, I think, in the ways that they are invading our privacy, we're going to be at their mercy. So I completely agree about the regulation.
Well, one of the things that I do in that sense, David, is I Google weird stuff. I just go all over the place because it makes me less linear. You know what I'm saying? Even if I don't care about it, I'll just Google or look up or place online shopping for things that I don't even really feel interest in. Just because that's my paranoia.
I follow all of these pages that I shouldn't, right? Where people wouldn't expect me to. And then sometimes they'll get a notification on their page that I'm following a certain page. So I've had and like freak out and I'll get some email. It's like, you're following this person. How do you dare follow this person? Like, I study this stuff for a living. But I've had to figure out how to nuance those controls so that people can't tell as easily who I'm following. So like you kind of like hijack your own algorithms. Something I tend to do is I don't think it's as good as Google, which is really annoying. Sometimes I have to go to Google because it's better, but like DuckDuckGo is a search engine that's not tracking as much. Being careful about, I turn Siri off on my phone. Like there's like a skill at which you can make, like I teach a class called Surviving Social Media. And the whole point of the class is to equip my students with the understanding of what's happening so they can make choices about what they want to do. Right. So it's not a scare class, but it's if you use this service, know you're making this trade-off, or when you do this thing, this is what's happening. So what do you need to be aware of to like make sure that you're protecting yourself? I need to get going because my family's downstairs. So thank you all for having me. Pleasure to speak with you. David's got my contact information, as does Lauren. So have a great rest of your weekend. Take care.
Thank you so much, Nikki.
Go well.